The assets created within this major work were all constructed through a process of 3D modelling, unwrapping, and texturing, the process of which will be explained throughout this presentation. The following images showcase how I created the basic forms for each model, from a simple base mesh to a more complex object. Constructing organic models was a more complex process. For instance, the trees seen here were constructed with a skin modifier, also seen through the creation of the human and creature figures, in which the inbuilt sculpting tools were utilised. However, due to the high poly count of some of these models, such as the brick shown, normal and specular maps were baked from the high poly mesh in order to allow for more detail upon a lower poly mesh. For some of the simpler shrubs, I used the sapling add-on in order to easily add diversity in form and leaf particles. In order to create the items shown, I utilised full simulations with the following parameters, making sure that the physics of the objects match the constraints applied to each mesh. In order to texture these models, each item had to be UV unwrapped. Throughout this major work, I used various methods to achieve this. The more accurate and time-consuming method was to construct seams, shown in red. However, this process required further editing, as seen here when I'm cleaning up the UVs. One alternative method utilised was the UV Smart Project feature, which quickly created the desired UVs. However, this was not always a suitable process for all models due to the sometimes inaccurate nature, therefore used on less visible items. For very simple objects, a simple unwrap sufficed. Throughout this project, I experimented with various texturing methods, from hand-painted to using an altering image textures sourced from textures.com. This shows how I set up hand-painted texture painting within Blender. I created a new image, unwrapped the model, and made sure that the material matched the object shown. In order to paint the more complex models, many layers of colour in various opacities was added. In order to enhance the diffuse, I used the Crazy Brunt program to create accompanying specular and normal maps, in order to add glossiness and more dimension to the objects. This also shows how I used Photoshop to manipulate images to use within the texturing of various objects. Some more complex textures were quite difficult to construct, as seen through the node tree, allowing for overlays, random colour, and multiple textures on one image. In order to spread up this progress, I added the parameters of various inputs in order to create a more complex and versatile node. Another important step was the composition and lighting of various scenes. In order to do so, each asset was moved and placed onto a new layer in relation to its purpose. I also had to light each scene through various forms, including the inbuilt lamps and mission objects, which were all hidden in order to create an ambient light. In order for items such as grass, rocks, leaves, and small trees to be spread across the scene, particle systems were created. In order to make the scale, rotation, density, and location of these objects appear random over the scene, the following settings were utilised. This was used in conjunction with the weight painting tool in order to determine which parts of the scene would include certain objects. This was a tedious process as the rotation of the objects was not always matched the scene. In order to animate the scene, I created constraints to a path for a camera to follow, making sure that the positioning was accurate and did not interfere with the assets. I created keyframes for position, scale, rotation, and other forces. For the animation of singular elements, a rig was created. This shows a prototype rig I utilised for the human form. The process was repeated on the creature model, making sure that all movements weren't impaired. Constraints were added to the eyes in order to limit their movement. In order to repeat movements over a time frame, I made the movement cyclic, as shown in the images. Animation also proved to be very tedious and time-consuming. Rendering was a challenging process to complete. I had to render each animation in singular frames in order to avoid any unwanted artifacts. The setting I used to achieve this is shown. In order to reduce render times, I simplified some of the messages even further, as seen through the forest scene where I created alpha plane trees in order to mimic the behaviours of the 3D model while still remaining two-dimensional. After rendering, the single frames had to be exported in order to allow for further editing. After each element was rendered and exported, I enhanced them with an After Effects by altering the colour balance, levels, and curves. In order to add extra lighting detail, I used the radial blur with a fresh hold and tint effect, producing the result seen. For more complex scenes, I rendered out layers separately, meaning that the backgrounds had to be rotoscoped out and motion tracked. Alternatively, I used the Color Key and Color Range tool in order to remove dark backgrounds. Color correction was also added in order to make sure the colors matched. I then added various effects such as camera blur, shadows and displacement maps in order to enhance the scene, before rendering out these elements and adding transitions in order to create a more finalized product. Creating audio was a challenging process. I recorded various sounds and edited them in order to enhance the animated scenes. In order to make the backing track, I used GarageBand to create simple rhythmic patterns, as shown in the screen capture. After rendering these elements, I edited the pitch and volume in order for them to match the scene. Some simple audio effects were also sourced from royalty-free websites, as I did not have the capabilities to produce all the sounds found within the major work.